At the company party, with glasses clinking and artificial smiles lighting up faces that hid secrets, I walked between tables and red carpets holding an envelope. The paper, folded with precision, contained the end of a cycle, but also the beginning of something that even I couldn't imagine where it would end. I saw the two of them together, laughing as if the world were a play created just for them. And maybe it was. Perhaps my presence there was nothing more than a decorative element in a story written without my knowledge. When I got closer, still disguising the poison that was boiling inside my chest, I saw her eyes lose their shine instantly. The lover still smiled, not knowing that that night, for both of them, would be the longest and most humiliating of their lives. I handed over the letter. And when I heard her voice tremble, begging through tears that we talk, that nothing was what it seemed, that I was the love of her life, I just said what had been in my throat for months: you should have thought better of doing that stupid thing. No one expects to experience this kind of pain. No one wakes up on a Sunday and says, "Today I will be betrayed." Betrayal is not a blow, it is a sequence of small cuts, invisible to the naked eye, that tear you apart until the final moment, when the blood has spread all over the floor of your dignity. For months, maybe years, something inside me screamed in silence and discomfort that I couldn't name. And it wasn't just the carnal act, the shared bed or the stolen touches. It was the conspiracy. The lies organized like chess pieces in a game where I was the only one who didn't know I was playing. She laughed with him as she told me she was going to work late. She made love to me with the same mouth that kissed him days before. And when he said, "I love you," he did it with the coldness of someone who memorized lines to keep the play running. The lover, in turn, was not just an intruder, he was someone who knew exactly who I was. Someone who greeted me with forged respect, who knew my schedule, my routine, my silences. And still, smile. What no one expected, neither her nor him, was that I wouldn't react the way a betrayed man usually reacts. I didn't scream, I didn't break anything, I didn't threaten. I silenced. But the silence was just the prelude to the storm. While they celebrated their small victories, I gathered evidence. Print by print, call by call, conversation by conversation. And most of all, I listened. I heard audio that should never have been sent, I saw images that should never have been saved, and I understood that the world I had built for years was being demolished without my permission. But justice, when it does not come from laws, comes from truth. And even if it takes a while, it arrives like a hurricane. Revenge, contrary to what many think, is not impulsive. It is architected. I didn't just want to finish. I wanted to show the world who she really was. Every lie she told about me, every slander whispered in the ears of friends, colleagues and family to justify her infidelity, would turn against her. I needed everyone to see. Let everyone know. That she herself, when looking in the mirror, could no longer sustain the role of victim. So I chose the right stage, the company event. The place where everyone admired her. Where his image was impeccable, untouchable. Where she was the dedicated wife, the exemplary professional. But there, that night, I would rewrite her story with the words she herself spoke, only recorded. And everyone would listen. The reaction was exactly as I imagined. The silence in the room, the gazes shifting, the murmurs growing like a high tide. And she, standing next to her lover, eyes wide, seeing herself projected on the screen, saying things she could never deny. "He's an idiot, he has no idea what's going on around him, I pretend because it's comfortable, he gives me stability, but you're the one who makes me moan." Those phrases, spoken with disregard and pleasure, were now the ambient sound of his collapse. The lover tried to leave. But every exit was guarded. He would not escape unscathed. Not after what he did. She cried, said it was a mistake, that she loved me, that everything had been a mistake. But how can you love someone who allows themselves to laugh at their own lie? How can you forgive someone who, deep down, has never had remorse? The most curious thing is that the real punishment was not public humiliation. It wasn't the divorce, nor the loss of everything we built. It was her understanding that, by trying to destroy me, she destroyed herself. She lost not only her husband, but also the respect, her friends, the stability she said she valued. And above all, she lost her right to be heard. Because from then on, her every word sounded like a farce. All tears, like acting. And me? I was reborn. Yes, I was reborn from my own ashes as someone who learned to see between the lines. As someone who learned that love, when it is not reciprocated, is just prison. And I learned to free myself. In the process, I met someone who showed me what it's like to be looked at with truth, with real interest, with clean desire. But that's another part of the story. What she never knew, and may never discover, is that there was something even more painful behind it all. Something that would transform this entire plot into something even darker. Something neither of them imagined I knew. Something that I kept until the right moment to definitively destroy not only what was left of her image, but also that of her lover. And when that moment comes, even those who defended her will turn away. Because there are secrets that, when exposed, don't just ruin reputations, they unearth corpses that everyone thought forgotten. And what was buried between the three of us, was much dirtier than just betrayal. But what did they hide from me? And how, exactly, did I manage to find out? Welcome to the channel. Here, we make it clear from the beginning, we do not support, do not encourage and never romanticize any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but based on situations that reveal the raw truth. Betrayal destroys lives, families and souls. Our goal is to show, with intensity and realism, the devastating consequences of thoughtless choices. Get ready now to dive into a story strong, engaging and absolutely shocking. Press play, and feel the weight of the truth on your skin. Ethan and Clara were the kind of couple who, at first glance, seemed straight out of a modern romance novel. He, a meticulous, discreet project manager, she was a brilliant public relations person, with a contagious smile and an intelligence that stood out in any environment. They married young, after an intense courtship of just 1 year, driven by a quick, seemingly irrefutable connection. They both had plans, many plans. Travel, children, career. And they built a comfortable life over the course of a decade in a spacious 2-story house, with light-toned walls and a kitchen that she insisted on always keeping tidy. Their routine, although sometimes monotonous, seemed balanced. Ethan was methodical with his work, disciplined with his schedule and discreet at parties. Clara was the complementary opposite, talkative, social, involved with company events, with colleagues, with friends. Together, they completed each other. At least that's what everyone believed. She was the type who spent Sundays rearranging flowers in vases and her childhood photo albums in the living room closet. He liked cold white wine, French films and sleeping with an aromatic candle lit. He had a slight obsession with maintaining the appearance of the home, as if every object should express stability. He, on the other hand, was introspective. He liked cups with small latches, books with notes in the margins and looking at the same picture on the wall for long minutes while drinking his black, strong, sugar-free coffee. Ethan carried a silent nostalgia, inherited from a childhood marked by losses that he rarely verbalized. Clara seemed to fill this void with the intensity of her colors, her lively and engaging presence. Differences, for a long time, seemed the key to balance. Their marriage was respected, even envied. Friends often commented on how mature, centered, and harmonious they seemed. They participated in company get-togethers, dinners with friends, and group trips. Clara always with an elegant dress and a big laugh, Ethan with his impeccable formal shirt and serene posture. She started conversations, made connections, brought people together. He observed, understood the environment, and only spoke up when he had something accurate to say. A complementary couple, they would say. And they wouldn't be wrong. Except that what is complementary does not always stay together in the long term. Time began to form small cracks between them, almost imperceptible to the naked eye. Ethan began to immerse himself more in his work. Important projects came up, requiring more travel and hours in front of the computer. Clara, in turn, flourished in her career. He had become a strategic figure in the company where he worked, responsible for events, for closing agreements with high-profile clients, for keeping the institutional image at its peak. She began to be recognized beyond the office walls, mentioned in articles, invited to forums. He admired this, but he felt, little by little, a distance forming. They exchanged fewer confidences, dinners were quieter, eyes crossed less frequently. Still, they loved each other in their own way. They had a stable life, annual trips to carefully chosen places. The last one was to Tuscany, where they spent days among vineyards and cafes in small medieval streets. Ethan liked to walk hand in hand, Clara liked to record every moment in short videos that she kept as if they were relics. They had their traditions. Friday was wine and series night, Sunday was pancake day. Little routines that seemed to confirm the commitment. It was a comfortable life, although not on fire. And for a while, that was enough. Clara was extremely careful with everything around her. He had an effective memory with objects, with dates, with smells. She remembered the exact day Ethan proposed, the outfit she wore when they bought their first sofa together, the perfume he wore on their first nights. Ethan, on the other hand, was more restrained with his emotions, not out of lack of feeling, but out of defense. The pain of seeing his father leave home without looking back, even as a child, taught him to hide everything that hurt. But in Clara he saw a kind of emotional freedom that attracted him, calmed him. There was a kind of silent poetry in the way he looked at her when she spoke passionately about something she loved. A look from someone watching the sea without making any noise. The dynamics inside the house were silent, but functional. Clara would wake up earlier, leave the coffee brewed and the table set with a small flower next to it. Ethan arrived home from work and passed first through the laundry room, then through the living room, collecting his thoughts in short, calculated steps. The two knew how to move within that space like dancers who had rehearsed for years, even when the feelings were at different levels. There was no shouting, there was no fighting, there was no ice. There was silence. And this silence began to grow. Despite this, there were moments of intense connection. When they traveled, or when something really new broke their routine, the two rediscovered each other. The last wedding anniversary, for example, was full of symbolic gestures. She decorated the room with lights, prepared a special dinner, put on a playlist with songs from the first years. He, for the first time in a long time, wrote a letter. A simple letter, but full of memory. Clara cried. She said she loved him more every year. He responded with a calm kiss, a long hug. They slept together that night as if no years had passed. But the next day, life continued the same. There was a loyalty between them built on time and respect. Close friends said that the two understood each other in their eyes. That Ethan trusted Clara with his eyes closed. And that was true. Even with the routine taking its toll, even with the lack of adrenaline in his early years, he trusted her with a rare intensity. He never considered another woman, never hid passwords, never monitored his actions. Not because he was naive, but because he chose to believe. For him, love was a daily choice, and he chose it every day, even if in silence. Clara, in turn, was a little more restless. I was looking for signs. I needed validation, presence, active listening. Sometimes she felt alone, even with him around. But she always told herself that difficult times don't last, that love was stronger than tiredness. And they followed. At work, she shined more and more. She was praised by everyone, received invitations to gala events, had lunch with directors, traveled to monitor campaigns. Ethan, even in his discretion, enjoyed watching her grow. He used to say he was proud of the woman she had become. I took photos of her smiling at events and used them as the background on my cell phone. The two seemed, to external eyes, unreachable. A solid couple. A safe haven for each other. But it was within the small cracks of everyday life that the most dangerous winds began to blow. Clara had a magnetic charisma. He talked to everyone with enviable ease. Co-workers, customers, even strangers in elevators. Ethan was more reserved, preferring to observe. But the way she connected with the world was something that enchanted him from the beginning. Sometimes he found himself just listening to her voice telling stories, interacting with others, thinking about how lucky it made him feel. Yet, over time, that same charisma began to seem distant. The conversations between the two became more practical, more functional. She talked about work, he responded in monosyllables. She brought ideas for trips, he said maybe next month. And so, the months passed. But what no one knew, and not even Clara clearly perceived, was the weight that this silent distance carried. She tried to compensate with gifts, with unexpected dinners, with longer kisses on the doorstep. He responded with discreet gestures, coffee in bed, a shoulder massage after a difficult day. But the space between them was still there, like a locked room whose keys had been forgotten somewhere in the routine. Until the announcement of the company party came. A large event, with external guests, local press coverage and symbolic awards. Clara became deeply involved in the organization. It was a golden opportunity, both for her as a professional and for the company that was beginning to expand its visibility nationally. Ethan would be invited, as always. He would wear his best shirt, put a contained smile on his face and follow everything with the same serenity as always. But something that night was about to change forever. Because behind every scene of perfection, there was a shadow growing. Silent, subtle, camouflaged between smiles and promises. And even though none of them knew exactly what was coming, that night would mark the definitive turning point in their lives. But until then, everything still seemed intact. Until then, love, despite the noise, still seemed enough. Until then. In the week leading up to the company party, Clara was restless. There was a different energy in the air, a restlessness in his steps, in his shallower breathing at the end of the day. Ethan noticed her eyes brighter, her smiles longer when she looked at her cell phone, the cell phone that now spent more time facing down on the table, or that went with her to the bathroom, the kitchen, the bedroom, like an extension of her body. He tried not to think too much, tried to convince himself that it was just excitement about the event that she herself had helped organize, a professional delivery that required involvement down to the last detail. Still, something inside him began to move. A slight discomfort, like a shadow walking behind your eyes. At night, lying next to her, he watched her breathing quicken and her fingers dancing across the cell phone screen in silence, with small smiles that no longer included him. At work, Ethan was also under pressure. A new project had been brought forward and he spent hours in meetings, barely had lunch, barely slept. The distance between them, which was already customary, now stretched like an abyss. Conversations turned into messages, glances escaped. Still, he insisted on remaining calm. Maybe it was just a phase, maybe everything would go back to normal after the party. But inside himself, he was already beginning to suspect that something was slipping out of his hands. He remembered a night, a few days earlier, when he arrived home early from work and found Clara dressed in a new robe, with makeup on, with wine in a glass and candles lit. She said she was testing her outfit for the party and needed to relax after an intense afternoon. He believed, he wanted to believe. But the perfume was too strong for a simple test. The wine was already half finished, and the cell phone was nowhere to be found. Clara was more distracted, more sweet at times, as if she wanted to make up for something. Quick kisses, kind words, texts throughout the day that said, "I thought of you," or "We need to reconnect." But these messages were always accompanied by an absence, as if they were part of a script that she herself no longer knew how to truly interpret. Ethan, although hurt inside, was smiling. He was a man who knew how to hide his pain. The last thing I wanted to do was play paranoid, controlling. But something inside him was already breaking. The day of the party arrived. The hotel ballroom was stunning. Thick carpets, crystal chandeliers, carefully chosen ambient music. Clara looked stunning, in a long, sober dress, with a side slit that showed an elegance that bordered on provocative. The eyes turned to her like magnets. Co-workers greeted her enthusiastically, compliments came from all sides. Ethan, by his side, felt proud and at the same time out of place. I noticed how she moved easily among the guests, how she smiled more at certain looks, how she subtly touched the arm of one or another colleague while laughing, as if she wanted to ensure the full attention of everyone around her. He watched silently, as he always did. He took small sips of his whiskey, listened to bits of conversation, met uncomfortable glances that quickly looked away. At a certain point, Clara walked away to resolve an unforeseen issue with the ceremony. Ethan was alone for a few minutes, long enough to notice whispers and looks that seemed to pass through him. Women whispering with their eyes fixed on him, muffled laughter, as if they were laughing at something he didn't know, but that everyone around him already understood. When she returned, she seemed slightly nervous, her hair a little disheveled, her lipstick hastily touched up. He said they needed to fix a sound problem, but his eyes didn't meet his. Ethan didn't say anything, but the discomfort in his chest became almost palpable. The rest of the night went as expected. Speeches, awards, photos. Clara in the spotlight, Ethan in the background, discreet but attentive. Until it was time to dance. The couples began to move around the room slowly. She reached out to him with a practiced smile. He accepted. They danced for a few minutes in silence. He watched her closely, his eyes fixed on hers, and she seemed to avoid that contact. Finally, he asked if everything was okay. She said yes, just tired, that everything had gone well, and that she couldn't wait to get home and rest. But there was a hesitation in the voice, a noise between the words, a shadow in the eyes. After the dance, she walked away once again, saying that she needed to talk to the board about the feedback from the event. Ethan stood there for a moment, watching her move among the guests. Something inside him said that this would be the last time he would trust any word she said. He decided to walk around the room, aimlessly. He passed by the bar, where he heard two employees commenting, in low voices, something about them being together again and being too shameless. The two fell silent when they noticed his presence. Ethan pretended not to hear. He went to the terrace, breathed in the cold night air, tried to convince himself that he was exaggerating, that it was just tiredness, that nothing was really happening. But something inside him burned. That's when he saw him. The man, in a dark suit and a cynical smile, approached her from the other side of the room. He touched her waist like someone who had done it before, whispered something in her ear that made her smile with her eyes half closed. Clara discreetly looked around, and thinking that no one was watching, she touched his hand back, in a quick gesture, but too intimate to go unnoticed. Ethan stood still. The glass slipped slightly in his hand. It didn't need more. The world around became blurry, sounds became distant. It was as if time had stopped just for him. He decided not to do anything. Not there. Not that night. He knew he was not a man for scandals. But he also knew that that scene would never leave his memory. He calmly returned to the room, grabbed another glass from the bar and remained in the most discreet corner, watching. And then, everything fell into place. The quick messages, the delays, the averted glances, the out-of-time perfume, the restrained smiles. Like pieces of a sorted puzzle, everything was there. Treason was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact. He waited until the end of the party. He greeted colleagues and praised the event. Clara approached again and suggested that they leave. On the way to the car, she talked about the success of the night, the contacts she made, the future possibilities. Ethan smiled. Inside him, everything was in ruins, but on his face there was millimeter control. In the car, she held his hand. I said I was glad he went. He responded with just a nod. Inside, he organized the chaos that had been thrown into his life with the coldness of someone planning something bigger than a simple separation. That morning, while Clara slept next to him, with the serene face of someone carrying no guilt or fear, Ethan got up. He went to the office, opened a folder on the computer, connected the pen drive he kept in the locked drawer. The recordings, the prints, the messages, everything would start to be organized from there. It wasn't enough to know. It was necessary to prove it. It was necessary to show. But to show it with precision, with impact, with the same theatricality with which he had been deceived. The betrayal had been discovered. Now, it was just a matter of time for everything to be revealed in the right way, in front of those who needed to see it. Because there was something more. Something that had not yet been revealed. Something that made this whole story even dirtier than it seemed. Something that would make any return impossible. And the only person who didn't know that yet, was her. The day after the party was a sultry Sunday, with the sky covered in dense clouds, as if the atmosphere carried the same weight that Ethan felt in his chest. Clara woke up first, moving around the house with an almost cynical lightness. He prepared coffee, organized the table with fruit and bread and smiled as if the previous night had been just another routine celebration. Ethan watched her in silence, sitting at the table, her every gesture seemed choreographed, every word measured. He no longer needed to ask anything, he no longer needed to hear empty or rehearsed justifications. I already knew. I knew everything. And, more than that, he knew what he would do with every piece of truth he carried. On Monday, Ethan missed work. He just called to say he needed to resolve personal matters. Clara left early, as usual, mentioning meetings and a possible short trip in the middle of the week. He didn't respond. He just closed the door after leaving and then locked himself in the office. For hours, he reviewed the files he had, the audios, the photos, the captured messages, the public interactions disguised as professionals. He organized everything meticulously. Every name mentioned, every date, every detail that could dismantle the theater she had built. But the real trump card, the one he guarded most jealously, had not yet been revealed. Not even for him had it been easy to deal with. Because it wasn't just a loving betrayal. It was a betrayal of another nature. Something dirtier. Lower. More unforgivable. Throughout that week, Clara continued her routine undaunted. She continued to be the woman praised at work, the professional admired, the socially charming partner. But I didn't realize that something about her was beginning to be observed with more suspicion by some colleagues. Ethan had planted seeds, subtly. Loose pieces that provoked doubts, questions. A loose comment here, a meaningful look there. Until the day when, on a seemingly random morning, Clara received an invitation to participate in a company event at a new headquarters. It was another of her professional achievements, and she celebrated. Little did I know that that invitation was part of the scenario that Ethan had set up with surgical precision. The event took place the following Saturday, in a sophisticated conference room. Clara entered looking stunning, as always, aware that she was among the standout names that night. Ethan was already there, sitting in the front rows, calm, well-dressed, with the serene look of someone waiting for the exact moment to pull the trigger. She saw him and waved, surprised. He smiled at the corner of his lips and didn't get up. When she was called to the stage to receive an honorable mention for her performance, applause echoed throughout the room. But moments later, something unexpected happened. The main lights went out and, within seconds, the giant screens behind the stage began showing images that were not part of the night's schedule. The silence was absolute. The images showed Clara smiling in messages exchanged with another man, intimate compliments, meetings arranged in a tone of desire, small recordings of quick encounters disguised as meetings. The audience held its breath. Faces slowly turned towards her, as she stood frozen in the center of the stage, her hands sweaty and her eyes wide. He tried to walk to the corner, but the images continued. In one of them, her voice sounded clear, crystal clear, as she told her lover that the marriage was just a facade, that Ethan was predictable, a necessary weight to maintain her stable social image. People didn't know what to do. Some stood up, others just watched in embarrassed silence. Clara looked at Ethan, who remained sitting, with his hands crossed and his face intact. She stumbled off the stage, her heels seemed to sink into the carpet as if the floor had lost its grip. When she reached Ethan, she whispered that she needed to talk to him. He got up, followed her to one of the empty corridors and, finally, spoke in a deep, firm and painful voice. He said he had known everything for weeks. That he had enough evidence to destroy his reputation if he wanted to. That video was just the beginning. She tried to justify herself, started crying, said she was confused, that she had lost herself, that she never wanted to hurt him. But he didn't react. He just watched, with a kind of coldness she had never seen in him. And then, with an almost indifferent tone, he said that what had just happened was still little. That the worst was yet to come. She opened her eyes wide, asked what else he knew. He took a deep breath, looked into her eyes and said he wanted to ask her one last question before telling her what was about to be revealed. I wanted to know if she was sorry. She recognized what she had done, not just with him, but with everyone who trusted her. She, sobbing, replied yes, that she was destroyed inside, that she would never forgive herself again. Ethan then took a small recorder out of his pocket, pressed a button and played audio. It was Clara's voice. But the content wasn't for everyone. It was an excerpt from a private conversation she had had with a colleague at the company, weeks before, in a tone of contempt and arrogance. She said that, to move up professionally, she needed to cut ties with what she called dead weight. That he had manipulated the company's own confidential information, passing on data to external contacts through his lover. That Ethan was just a bridge, a means to get further, that there was never love, only convenience. He also said that, if everything went wrong, he would blame it on him. That he would be the idiot in the story. Clara collapsed to the floor. The body no longer reacted. The legs weakened. Ethan remained standing, looking at her as if he were looking at a stranger. He said that he had made copies of that audio, which he had sent to the company's legal department, that was the last time he would see her in his life. Clara tried to get up, beg, explain that those words were said in a moment of anger, of confusion. But there was no turning back. Her time was up. Ethan walked out of the building with firm steps. There was no satisfaction on his face, nor sadness. There was only the knowledge that despite the pain, humiliation and disappointment, he had done what needed to be done. Not for revenge, but for justice. And because the truth, when it is finally exposed, has the power to crush even the most resistant masks. But what Clara still didn't know, was that that scandal was still just the surface. Because there was one detail, one last piece of the puzzle, that would make everything even more cruel. Something that would turn his betrayal not just into an emotional or ethical mistake, but into something criminal. Something that could land her behind bars. And that revelation would come soon. Clara spent the next night locked in her own guest room. He had barely managed to collect his things after the collapse of the ceremony and, when he returned home, he found the locks changed, the upstairs lights turned off and a note on the main door with just 2 words written in black marker, "Good luck." She went to a friend's house, one of the few who still answered her messages, although with a certain tone of judgment in her voice. He slept only a few hours, waking up several times between confused nightmares and fragments of memories from the previous night. The shame, the public exposure, Ethan's cold and calculated tone when he played her the audios, everything reverberated in her mind as if she were trapped in a cruel loop of humiliation. She had fallen from a pedestal she believed to be eternal, but what gnawed at her most was the feeling that there was still something unrevealed, something between the lines of his gaze that promised more than simple exposure. There was punishment. The next morning, Clara tried to contact colleagues at the company, hoping to clarify or alleviate the damage. No response. The institutional email was already blocked. The director's cell phone rang until it went to voicemail. In the work group, it had already been removed. It was as if she had disappeared from a universe that she herself helped build. He also tried to contact his lover, now involved in his own crisis, after the information leak scandal and the summary dismissal that came hours after the event. He didn't even answer. The last messages exchanged with him were there, still fresh, but filled with one-sided despair. She wondered how everything had gotten so out of control, how the web she thought she had mastered had turned against her with such precision. Meanwhile, Ethan didn't stop. The morning after the event, he had already filed documents with a notary, spoken to his lawyer and sent files to the company's compliance team. He knew that everything he was about to do required precision. He was fully aware that it was not enough to destroy an image, it was necessary to dismantle a structure built on lies and manipulation. And now, the final moment arrived. The revelation that would make everything irreversible. That same afternoon, Clara was summoned to the police station. A formal notification, with an appointment and signature of the prosecutor responsible for the case. She, still shaken, could barely read the content completely. He called a lawyer he already knew, a specialist in public image cases, and scheduled an emergency meeting. When he arrived at the police station, the world he knew collapsed once and for all. It was received by two investigators who presented, with documents in hand, the true core of the complaint: improper use of confidential company information, undue favoritism in internal tenders and illegal transfer of strategic data to competitors. All under your name. Everything tracked, documented and digitally signed. The lover, who had served as a bridge for external contacts, had already given a statement, and protected himself by claiming that Clara was responsible for obtaining all the data. She, astonished, tried to stammer denials, but each sentence was crossed by new printed documents, emails sent from her IP, prints of conversations, audios where her voice confirmed dates, spreadsheets and confidential terms. This can't be right, he murmured, his eyes lost. That wasn't me who did it. I would never sign a contract with that language. This is not my text. The investigator, already accustomed to this type of reaction, pulled out one last page, handed it to her calmly and said, "This is the contract you authorized. The signature is digital, yes. But we have a recording that may be of greater interest. Someone gave it to us voluntarily. Want to hear?" Clara nodded with an almost imperceptible gesture. The audio began with a male voice, Ethan's, on a call with the company's legal department. He reported a suspicion that his wife was using privileged access to pass on confidential documents. Then, the audio changed to a conversation between Clara and her lover, where she advised him on how to mask the submissions, using Ethan's institutional email as a facade, so that the documents appeared to have left the system with her husband's authorization. She said that, if something was discovered, all she had to do was point out the digital traces to him, as he would never suspect anything, and he trusted her blindly. The plan was perfect. But she didn't know that Ethan had already suspected it for months, and that since then he had been recording calls, tracking records, collecting everything with patience. Clara got up from her chair slowly, her mouth half open, without a sound. The hands were shaking. The penny finally dropped. She had dug her own grave with the words she used to protect herself. The coldness with which he planned everything, now heard loud and clear, made any attempt at victimization impossible. For the first time in weeks, guilt ripped through the shield of arrogance and self-defense. He cried. Not as someone who seeks compassion, but as someone who understands that they have reached the bottom. That all that was left was silence and consequence. Outside, Ethan waited. Not out of need to witness its destruction, but out of duty. He needed to see her leave that building not as the woman who deceived him, but as the person who, on her own, decided to bury everything they had built. When Clara saw him, standing on the sidewalk, still shaken by what she had heard and what she had been accused of, her reaction was immediate. She walked towards him, unhurriedly, and stopped a few meters away. Red eyes, swollen face, labored breathing. "Why?" he said, in a hoarse whisper, "why did you do that? Why did you destroy me like that?" Ethan looked at her with the calm of someone who had overcome pain, with the serenity of someone who had seen hell up close and decided not to take anyone with him. He took a deep breath and replied, because you destroyed what I protected most. My peace. My truth. My name. You could have left me. I could have been honest. But he chose to use me, to blame me before anything even happened. It wasn't just the betrayal, Clara. It was the plan. The calculation. The coldness. And now you will answer for it. She tried to take another step, but stopped halfway. The weight of what he had become prevented any movement. Ethan turned and got into the car, leaving her there, in front of her own shadow, without strength or argument. That night, while social media was already spreading the scandal, and the company released an official statement, Clara retired to a borrowed room, with no floor, no horizon. She was no longer remembered as the exemplary professional, but as the symbol of a corporate coup disguised as charisma. Ethan, in turn, ended the day in silence, opening a new bottle of wine and watching the last recording he made, a video in which he himself, looking directly into the camera, narrated the entire story, from the first clue to the last click of evidence. It was the end of the cycle. And he knew, after that, life would take a completely new direction. Because despite everything he had lost, there was something Clara could never take from him again. The truth. The street looked different that morning. The sky maintained the same gray tone as the last few days, but there was something in the air that suggested an imminent end, or perhaps, the beginning of a new absence. Ethan walked slowly along the boardwalk next to the river, his steps rhythmic as if each one served to wash away the last residue of the storm that had passed. On his face, there were no traces of the tension that had accompanied him for weeks. The look was distant, tired, but serene. The hands were cold despite the temperature, as if they still carried the symbolic weight of everything they were forced to do. He knew that some decisions could not be taken back. And that, no matter how fair they were, they didn't always leave only relief. The soul also charges itself, even when reason is at peace. Clara spent the following days in isolation, almost like someone in exile. I avoided going out, I avoided connections, I even avoided my own thoughts. Every mirror in the house where she was now temporarily staying condemned her with the coldness of a court. There were no more messages of support. No attempt to reverse what had been revealed. People were moving away like people fleeing a ship about to sink. Not out of cowardice, but because there was no longer any doubt about who had dug the hole. She walked barefoot, in loose clothes, her face clean, without makeup, as if the weight of her own identity had been dissolved along with the mask that had fallen off in public. Every second of his routine was now populated by memories of his own voice in the leaked audios, by the image of the screens displaying the evidence in front of so many incredulous eyes. But what weighed most heavily on him, what hurt most deeply, was remembering Ethan's expression, not at the moment of exposure, but the last time they spoke. There was no hate there. There was a kind of disappointment so clean, so deep, that it became even more cruel than any revenge. The repercussions of the case spread with impressive speed. Corporate websites, social networks, groups of former colleagues. Her name was mentioned with contempt and astonishment. Not just because of the personal betrayal, but because of the institutional coup that almost undermined the company's reputation. The lover, in turn, tried to clean up his own image by offering to collaborate with the courts. His name is also tarnished, but with fewer chances of punishment. Clara, on the other hand, faced the real possibility of a conviction. Documents and evidence gathered in such detail made any claim of innocence unlikely. Legal advice recommended silence and a collaborative stance. She had no choice. It was no longer about saving his career or his marriage. It was about trying to save what was left of herself. Ethan, even after having dismantled everything with almost surgical precision, felt no pleasure in seeing the state Clara was in. But he didn't feel sorry either. She had had choices. Lots of. And he chose the path that, once revealed, allowed no return. The emptiness he carried now was different. It was no longer the pain of betrayal, nor the fear of appearing ridiculous in the eyes of others. It was the sadness of knowing that love, no matter how sincere it had been, had not been enough to stop her from becoming who she became. He didn't seek revenge. Never looked. But justice needed to be done. Not because of the pain she caused him, but because of what she represented as a symbol of what is lost when the truth is corrupted. Little by little, he began to return to his routine. He moved to a new apartment, smaller, quieter, with large windows and plants on the balconies. He resumed running training and meeting up with the few friends he had left. He was respected by everyone, but he rarely spoke about what happened. He preferred silence, he preferred to rebuild himself in silence. Inside, he struggled with a dilemma that was difficult to name. As much as he knew he did the right thing, a part of him still wondered if he had crossed an ethical line by planning everything so coldly. If it would have been less cruel to let the betrayal dissolve in silence, end everything discreetly, and move on. But he soon remembered how much he was used, the conversations in which she planned to blame him, the lies articulated with a level of coldness that bordered on calculated. No, he hadn't been cruel. He just protected himself. But that didn't stop the guilt from visiting him, like an uncomfortable whisper in the early mornings when sleep was hard to come by. It was on one of these nights that, for the first time in weeks, he opened his laptop and reread the letter he had written months earlier for their wedding anniversary. The letter she would have received if he hadn't discovered everything in time. He talked about the future, about children, about simple dreams like growing old next to her, drinking coffee on the balcony. Words that, now, seemed written by another man. A man who no longer existed. And then, without thinking much, he deleted the file. Not out of anger. But because some things don't need to be kept. They need to be left behind, so that space opens up for what is yet to come. Clara, on the other side, felt trapped in an existence that was no longer hers. Her every gesture now seemed like a failed attempt to regain the dignity that had been lost along with the trust of everyone around her. He tried to write a letter to Ethan. Not to explain yourself, but to ask for forgiveness. He didn't make it. The words stuck. Because she knew that forgiveness, at that moment, would sound like another strategy, another manipulation. And she didn't want him to think that. For the first time, she wanted to be seen as human. Fallible. Sorry. But he understood that perhaps it was already too late for that. That time, although it heals, also closes doors. It was her mother who visited her days later, bringing a bag with clean clothes and some documents she needed to sign. The woman, always austere, now carried a look of veiled sadness. She sat next to her daughter and said that although she was disappointed, she still loved her. But it was time to take responsibility. To accept what he did, face the consequences and try, one day, to rebuild something new. Clara just cried. Not with despair, but with the resignation of someone who knows they are reaping exactly what they sowed. Ethan, weeks later, was invited to speak at an internal conference at the new company he had transferred to. The theme was ethics and integrity in the corporate environment. At first he was hesitant, but ended up accepting. He took the stage with the same reserved posture as always, looked at the audience and spoke simply. He did not mention names. He did not share details of what he experienced. But he talked about how trust, once broken, is like glass, even if it's mended, it will never be the same. He said that, in times of cynicism, being honest may seem naive, but it is, in fact, the most powerful form of resistance. The room applauded, but he didn't smile. He walked down from the stage in silence, went to the dressing room and, before leaving, received a note handed over by an employee of the organization. It was short. It simply said, "You taught me that dignity doesn't shout, it just remains. Thank you." He didn't know who it was. But he kept it. That night, as she walked home, she noticed something in her own chest that she hadn't felt in a long time, lightness. The story was still alive inside him, but he no longer controlled it. It no longer defined his days. It was slowly saying goodbye, like a tide that, little by little, recedes to give way to a new cycle. But something still awaited him. Something that would come from where I least expected it. Because, even after everything, destiny still had one last surprise in store. One last conversation. And maybe, a new beginning. Autumn began to make its mark on the sidewalks, covering the paths with yellow leaves that danced in the timid wind of the first cold mornings. Ethan watched from the window of his new apartment, a forgotten cup of coffee in his hand, now cold. The last few days had been one of silence, of internal reconstruction, of a kind of solitary freedom that, although desired, brought with it a serene melancholy. The exposure, the scandal, the lawsuits, the losses, everything now seemed distant, as if it belonged to a story told by someone else. But there was a new presence in his life. Not sweeping, not impulsive. Something that was born without promises, without rush, but that little by little, gained space. It was Olivia, a data analyst he had met at his new job. A woman of few words, an observant look and a rare sensitivity. They had lunched together a few times, walked after work, exchanged confidences without needing to delve into the scars. She didn't ask about the past, and he felt no urgency to explain it. With her, there was just presence. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan accepted Olivia's invitation to visit a photography exhibition at a cultural center in the old city center. The images portrayed ordinary people in intimate and silent moments, a mother fixing her daughter's hair in front of the mirror, a man sitting in a hospital hallway holding a ring, an elderly man reading an old letter with teary eyes. In one of the photos, a couple looked at each other in silence, hands almost touching, eyes distant. Ethan stood there for a while, feeling a weight on his chest that he couldn't name. Olivia approached, didn't say anything, just put her hand on his shoulder. And in that gesture, without words, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, understanding without demand. It was at that moment that he realized he was allowing himself something new. Not a replacement, not a leak, but a new chance. And that scared him a little. Because loving, after having been betrayed, requires a courage that few know. Meanwhile, Clara began to fulfill the legal obligations of the process. The agreement reached with the prosecution required her to perform community service for a period of time, in addition to a considerable fine and the permanent loss of her position. His name was still spoken in corporate corridors, but now as a warning example. She had cut her hair, moved to another neighborhood, and assumed a more modest life. He spent his days working in a public library, organizing collections, serving elderly people who were looking for old novels and students who asked about contemporary authors. It was like living in a bubble of silence and paper. And that, as strange as it seemed, brought him some comfort. She had lost everything, but she had gained the chance to look at herself without the usual filters. She no longer wore heels, she no longer wore makeup. He carried on his face the pallor of the truth that, in the end, he had to accept. His mistakes, no matter how big they were, now had a name, form and consequence. One morning, while organizing a batch of donated books, Clara found a copy with an old cover, with a dedication on the first page. It was a book about choices and morality. In the dedication, someone had written, "So that you never forget that every decision has a price, and sometimes, the one who pays is the one you love most." She closed the book tightly. He felt his stomach turn. The sentence passed through her as if it had been written for her. She looked up, took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long time, she wanted to be forgiven not just by Ethan, but by herself. He no longer carried hope of rebuilding what he had lost, but wanted to rebuild himself as someone better than he had been. And that, he understood then, would be the longest journey of all. Days later, Ethan received a letter. Handwritten, with no visible sender, with firm but hesitant letters. When he opened it, he immediately recognized the handwriting. No signature required. It was Clara. The letter did not ask for forgiveness. It didn't beg for dialogue. It was a simple text, where she narrated what she had been experiencing. He described the tasks in the library, the short conversations with strangers, the new way of seeing the world without the filter of vanity. He said he had finally understood what he had done, not just to him, but to everyone around him. She said she carried shame not as a punishment, but as a sign that there was something conscious left inside her. And in the end, he just said, "I don't ask you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that, even late, I learned." Ethan read the letter in silence, folding it carefully after a few minutes. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. But he felt, for an instant, an unexpected peace. As if a door had finally been closed. He didn't respond. He didn't think he needed it. Some stories do not end with a final point, but with the silence of those who chose to continue without carrying the weight of what can no longer be changed. The next night, he went out to dinner with Olivia. They walked to a small restaurant, hidden in an alley with yellowish lights. During dinner, she mentioned a trip she wanted to take, and for the first time, he found himself imagining himself there with her. The mountains, the cold, the fireplace. Not as an escape, but as a possibility. Olivia looked at him in a way no one had looked at him in a long time. As if he saw who he was now, not who he had been. And that was enough. Meanwhile, Clara, that same night, closed the library and walked to the small room she rented at the back of an old house. Passing by a newsstand, he saw a couple embracing under an awning. It was something simple, but it hurt her. Not because of jealousy, but because of the memory of how things can be lost for so little. She thought about Ethan, about how he might have already moved on, about how his life was different now, and that she was no longer part of it. He smiled sadly and continued on his way. Did you know that some losses are permanent? But he also knew that it was no longer about recovering the past. It was about learning to live with what was left. And maybe, with time, with luck and truth, build something new. Even if never as beautiful as before. Even if different. But real. And it was like this, between silent steps and heavy decisions, that each one followed their path. Ethan finding new ways to love. Clara, trying, finally, to become someone who one day deserves to be loved again. Both carrying scars. But alive. And, above all, lucid about the prices that life exacts when you choose the easiest path. Because love, no matter how strong it is, never survives the absence of truth. And when trust is broken, what remains is not longing. It's a lesson. Spring arrived with a shy sun, as if it was afraid to shine with all its strength in the midst of a world that still seemed to be recovering from a winter that was too long. Ethan watched the first flowers bloom through the windows of the cafe where he used to work on Saturdays. I was alone that morning, but there was no loneliness. There was, indeed, a curious sensation of a new beginning, of firm ground after the storm. Time had taken charge of reorganizing his emotions, of rearranging what pain had undone, and he, although still marked by everything he had experienced, now knew that his scars would no longer define his steps. He had achieved something rare, passing through destruction without becoming part of it. Olivia arrived with her hair tied up in an unassuming way, a discreet smile and a book in her hands. He sat down in front of him, as if it were just another date, but Ethan knew that day would have a different weight. They were both there for a reason they had been rehearsing for weeks, to decide what they would be. He had hesitated, out of fear, out of respect for his own time, because he didn't want to fall into the trap of giving himself up again before knowing who he was really walking with. But now, after months of silent construction, he knew. Olivia was not a replacement for a void. It was the discovery of a new meaning. She didn't want to fix it, or shape it. I just wanted to be. And that, at that moment in life, was worth more than any promise. Over coffee, they talked about traveling, about work, about the idea of renting a space together in the future. There was no rush. Olivia said she liked the idea of taking it slow. Ethan smiled. I liked it too. Suddenly, life seemed less about grand gestures and more about small moves. It was no longer about erasing the past, but about building something new without having to hide from it. When she held his hand on the table, he no longer felt the automatic pain reflex. He felt peace. And for the first time in a long time, he understood that he hadn't won, he hadn't taken revenge, he had just freed himself. And that, in the end, was all he needed. Meanwhile, Clara received a call from a small independent publisher interested in publishing a collection of chronicles written by women in the process of starting over. One of those responsible had read a text of hers, published anonymously on a blog, where she spoke, with brutal honesty, about the fall and the lessons that came afterwards. The text went viral in discreet circles, shared by people who recognized traces of their own story in her pain. The editor didn't know his real name, just wanted to talk. Clara hesitated for days. He thought about refusing, he thought about deleting the blog, disappearing altogether. But after walking aimlessly for hours, he stopped in front of the bedroom mirror and asked himself what he would do if he were no longer afraid of judgment. And then, he took a deep breath and responded to the email with a yes. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, in an old mansion transformed into a creative space. Clara arrived with sweaty hands and eyes marked by sleepless nights, but with her head held high. Upon entering, she was greeted with empathy. Not with idolatry, not with piety. Just with respect. The editor listened to his story without rushing, leafed through the texts carefully and, in the end, said that there was truth there. And that truth, even when born from pain, has power. Clara didn't cry, she didn't celebrate. Just said thank you. He knew he wasn't getting an absolution, but rather a chance. And that, at that point in his life, was the greatest gift he could ask for. The project was approved, and she spent the following months rewriting her story not to justify herself, but to understand herself. And perhaps, help others to do the same. As for the man with whom she had cheated on Ethan, his trajectory followed the expected path. He tried to reinvent himself in another company, in another city, but the traces of the scandal followed him. Lost trust, once stamped on the names of those involved, was difficult to rebuild. Little by little, he became anonymous. Invitations to lectures disappeared, contacts became distant, and the image he cared for so much crumbled. He tried to hold Clara responsible for everything, he tried to separate himself from the dirt, but the truth spared no one. In the end, he was not punished by law, but was exiled for his own reputation. A slow, silent, but definitive punishment. Ethan and Clara never saw each other again. Not even by chance. She never tried to get back together. He never sought a last talk. Both understood, each in their own time, that certain stories need to end with the weight they deserve. The love that existed between them was not erased, but was buried with dignity. And for that reason, he didn't need any late explanations. Each one continued with the pain and truths they needed to carry. He found another way. She, another way of existing. And so, they closed the cycle. Years later, on a cloudy afternoon, Ethan passed a bookstore while walking with Olivia. They stopped to have some tea. While she looked at the releases, he absently leafed through a bookshelf of chronicles. It was then that he saw her name. Small, discreet, at the foot of a book with a sober cover. About falling and learning to get up. Didn't buy the book. But he held it for a few minutes. He read the first paragraph and recognized the voice. There was pain there, but there was truth. And, in an almost symbolic gesture, he smiled. He returned the book to the shelf and walked back to Olivia. When she asked if he found anything interesting, he just said, a lot. But nothing I need to take home. Now it's up to you. Comment below what you thought of this story. Which part moved you the most? What would you do in Ethan's place? Or Clara's? Your opinion matters a lot and can help other people reflect on their own choices. Take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and not miss any of the next impactful stories like this. And never forget, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. The stories told here are fictional, but they reflect the real consequences that lies, manipulation and disrespect can cause. Because love only survives where there is truth. And where there is betrayal, one day, the truth always appears.